And now prepare yourself for what is coming next. It's a very important part of our event, an international panel on regulation from the perspective of international organizations. I mentioned before, this year's conference marks an important milestone by also including other international governmental organizations and speakers from non-EU countries to the discussion on AI policy, discussion with experts, member states, and the wider community of stakeholders as represented in the European AI Alliance Forum. The plenary will be moderated by Ms. Lucilla Scioli. She's the Director for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Industry within DG Connect at the European Commission. She's responsible for the coordination of the European digitization of industry strategy and for policy development in the area of artificial intelligence. So, Ms. Scioli, you will talk about the regulatory proposal from the perspective of international organizations. Please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. I will be chairing a very interesting panel, not only because of the international angle that we will approach, but also because it is the first, at least in my experience in this past 1 year and a half, it is the first time that I can chair a hybrid panel. I have some distinguished guests that are present physically here and others that are present online. I will try to do my best in organizing this complex stage presence, but I would like to say a couple of words before turning to the speakers. First of all, remind you that this morning we have discussed the European proposal for a regulatory framework on AI, and that this proposal that has been discussed from different viewpoints and from different actors and stakeholders has an important impact also at the international level, because if I'm not wrong, it's probably the first example of a comprehensive legislation on artificial intelligence. And of course, this will have an impact at the international level, and it has to have an impact at the international level because the European Union, of course, is part of the global system of nations where we trade and we exchange and we communicate on our needs. And after all, artificial intelligence, like many digital technologies, is borderless. And so today, we have invited representatives of different organizations, including also from member states, exactly to discuss how we can strengthen our international discussion on trustworthy artificial intelligence and what is the role of each of these different organizations exactly in doing that. So I will introduce my speakers as I ask them their first question. And I am actually going to ask from one of the guests who is present online. It's Mr. Cédric O, Secretary of State for Digital Transition and Electronic Communications in France. And I would like to ask him, first of all, what is the contribution of your organization to the promotion of human-centric AI in Europe and in the world? And of course, by your organization, we mean the ministry and the position you have in France.
Well, thank you very much for having me today, and thank you to the Slovenian presidency for setting up that debate, which I think is at the heart of one political issues that we'll have to deal with in the coming years. As you may know, France has been really committed into pushing that idea of human-centric AI, both within the European institution, within the discussion around that regulation of AI that we've been discussing on, but also at the international level. And you were mentioning the fact that this is a global discussion that we shall have. And I want to mention the French initiative that we've been taking with Canada and among the OECD framework in order to set up the global partnership on AI. We do think that we shall have a double track discussion. The first track is about a scientific discussion. We have a lot of scientific question about what is the assessment of the impact of AI and technology in verticals and the ethical impact, but also the opportunities and the balance between opportunity and risks. But also we should have a discussion, a scientific discussion on enforcement of our regulation. It's not so easy to enforce regulation of AI because there are a lot of AI technologies that are not explainable, for instance, as far as machine learning is concerned, for instance. So we do think that we should have a double track discussion, both on the scientific side, but also on the legal and political side. And this is why we welcome that initiative of the Slovenian presidency to address that issue of how do we come from discussion and philosophy to action as far as AI is concerned.
Thank you very much. And now I will turn to Mrs. Marielza Oliveira, who is also online. She's from UNESCO. She's the Director for Partnership and Operational Program Monitoring. So, Marielza, what is the contribution of UNESCO for the promotion of human-centric AI?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank the Slovenian presidency for this invitation to speak at this very important conference. And hello to our speakers and to the audience. Well, UNESCO contributes to human-centric AI in many different ways. First and foremost, we advocate for human rights-based AI, facilitating exchange of ideas, best practices. We organize, a series of AI forums, such as regional ones that recently took place in Africa and Latin America, to help to frame regional and national agendas around the human-centric AI development and use. We strengthen evidence underpinning these exchanges, for example, through surveys on policy priorities, needs assessments, like the ones we conducted in Africa, collecting information from 32 countries, and is now serving to guide the capacity development efforts by UNESCO, the UN, and other multilateral organizations. Second, we set international standards. Case in point is the upcoming recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, through which 193 member states of UNESCO have arrived at a common understanding of what the values are that should guide AI across different policy areas, and on the need for instruments to ascertain the ethical impacts of AI systems. The recommendation is actually going to be considered for adoption by UNESCO member states in November this year. Third, we provide policy guidelines to support national initiatives in developing human-centered AI. Just two quick examples on that. Guidance with cases and best practices on the results of the Beijing Consensus on AI and education that cover 5 policy areas, and also guidelines on how to incorporate multi-stakeholder processes in the development of national AI policies. And finally, we also uncover blind spots in AI development, governance, and use. For example, together with the Quebec AI Institute, we are doing research on issues that are missing from the current discussions on AI, focusing on the impacts on vulnerable and marginalized groups. A critical part of what we do is actually to build capacities. And on the side of duty bearers, for example, we recently conducted a survey on AI capacities among judicial operators from 100 countries and identified a critical and very urgent need to inform and update judges, lawyers, prosecutors, civil servants in the judicial sector on the benefits, the opportunities, and threats of AI systems. We have just opened registration for a massive online open course on AI and the rule of law that will be conducted in early 2022 to cover the use of AI in courts for both administrative and judicial processes and the legal implications of AI that courts are increasingly being called upon to educate. So we can't really develop regulation if the judicial system itself is not ready, to process AI and understand it. But also on the side of the AI rights holders, as part of the work we do on digital empowerment, we have launched a global online micro-learning on AI and human rights that cover issues of freedom of expression, right to privacy, right to equality, and bring these issues to young people through, for example, gamification, animation, mobile-first learning approaches, and so on. So there's a lot that we do in this area, and there's a lot more to come. So I hope I'll have the chance to really let you know what's going on in UNESCO on that side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me now turn to Mr. Gregor Stroin, You are the chair of the Ad hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, CAHI, at the Council of Europe. So what is the role of the Council of Europe for promoting trustworthy AI?
Thank you for the question, and thank you to the organizers for having me here. Council of Europe has a long tradition of addressing the impact of new technologies on its core business, which is human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And AI is just one of the technologies in the progression that we've seen in the past decades. We've seen it addressing medicine, pharmaceutical products in the 60s. We've seen it addressing automated data processing in the 80s. We've seen it addressing cybersecurity in the 90s. We have the Budapest Convention as a basis for international cooperation between countries. And this is a convention developed by the Council of Europe. Also, GDPR is a descendant of the Convention 108 on data processing, and it was developed in 1980. When it comes to artificial intelligence, Council of Europe has the ability to bring together 47 member states, all the member states of European Union, plus 20 additional states, to the same table to discuss the potentials for legally binding and effective instruments. And basically, this is what we're doing at CAHI. CAHI has a mandate of 2 years, and in the first year, we have looked at the need for any legal instruments that would have a binding character. Do we actually need it, or can we do with the existing documents, with the existing instruments? We have established that while there are already legal instruments that are addressing different aspects of AI and its impact on human rights, there are significant gaps, both on a substantive level and from a procedural level, how these gaps are preventing individuals and society from getting their rights, or preventing the AI from negatively impacting their rights. And on the basis of this feasibility study, our next step was to look at what kind of instruments would be needed to supplement this. And at this point, we are in the development of the elements for a potential legally binding instrument, and hopefully we will develop these elements by the end of this year. And this is going to be a basis for the negotiations for a new treaty on AI. And the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe member states has decided that the negotiations on this should start by May 22. So this is the broad outline on what we're doing and why.
Thank you very much. That's very intense indeed. And now from the OECD, we know the OECD is doing a lot on AI, and so Andrew Wyckoff is the Director for Science, Technology and Innovation. And the same question for you, if you can summarize in 3 minutes what the OECD is doing for trustworthy AI.
No, thank you, Lucia. And yeah, as you say, we've been at this since 2016. Really, it came out of the G7 meeting of that year at Takamatsu, led by Japan. And 3 years later, we were able to take to our council, which is the governing body of the OECD, our AI principles, which then the 38 members adopted. And since then, 6 other non-members, actually, like Brazil and Singapore, have adopted as well. And within them, they embody a human-centric approach. It's about trustworthiness, it's about privacy, it's about accountability, as you said earlier in your remarks, and others. Now, principles are great, and they give you boundaries and limits, which I think are important for shaping them to make sure they achieve the goals that we want. But you need to go beyond principles, and that's what Minister O was talking about a second. We're doing that through 3 different approaches. The first is that he described very well, is a global partnership on AI, which OECD has the honor of hosting the secretariat to. But it's quasi-independent from the OECD. It's important to emphasize that. And it really is what he was saying, trying to take principles into practice, operational tools for making some of these human-centric ideals come to life. The second is we have an AI observatory. And there, it's the OECD bread and butter of trying to put evidence underneath what is an issue filled with a lot of passion and sometimes politics. And we do that two ways. We love hard data at the OECD, so we're trying to get data on AI R&D, AI skills, AI diffusion, just so that we can begin to have a more evidence-based approach to policy making. The second is exactly that policy making. And here we've partnered with the European Commission. I'm very proud of it. We have a database with more than 800 different AI policies that is fed by 62 contact points around the globe just to vet. And this gives you, I think, a great way of sharing experiences and learning from each other. And just to end, we're going on, we're trying to develop our own tools, and these include tools such as helping with a risk-based approach. Because Europe has certainly led the way there. It's not the only country doing this. And so what we want to do is try to ensure that things are interoperable across the globe so that the promise of AI can really come to fruition.
Thanks a lot. And in fact, we collaborate on some of the areas, and we'll talk more about the Global Policy AI Initiative later today at the last session, I think, of the day. But now I turn to Mr. Michael O'Flaherty. He's the director of the European Agency for Fundamental Rights. We saw a video before, but maybe you can build on that and tell us, what does the agency do for AI?
Sure, thank you very much. Let me start by saying that I welcome how much reference there's been right through today to values, to fundamental, to human rights and their importance. I've heard nobody speak against the high attention that they need. And it's our job as an agency of the EU to support the delivery of those commitments through sound law policy and practice. We did that very much like the way we heard how the OECD works. It's highly applied, drilled down, looking at the use cases, looking at the reality of what is the challenge and how you tackle that on the ground in real time. By the way, I should say it's in a context of enormous opportunity, as we emphasize in that little video you showed, but also enormous risk. If I would quibble with anything from this morning, I think maybe the risk dimension was slightly underplayed. There was a distinction made in an intervention this morning between human rights risks and physical risks. I would say that the physical risks are also human rights risks. A risk to life is a risk to the right to life. But then in that context, what do we do specifically? Well, we've over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been focusing on some of the tough issues of AI and looked at how it works in practice and what the regulatory framework should be to address it. We've done that on facial recognition technology, and I'd argue that our findings have been reflected in the draft regulation. We've done that in areas of discrimination. We helped flag the risk of discrimination through the application of algorithms. But also, and equally importantly, we've been looking most recently at the ecosystem for regulation to see how ready it is, how open it is to be regulated from the point of view of human rights. Findings have been fascinating. Just a few examples. We interviewed hundreds of users of AI across Europe, and we found the primary driver of the use of AI is not quality, it's efficiency. Now that matters if you're in the business of making sure that everybody protects human rights. We asked them what they understand about human rights. High sensitivity to privacy, actually an exaggerated sensitivity to privacy, including misunderstandings of how GDPR works in practice, but very little awareness of the other rights, like non-discrimination and the whole array of other rights. And the final thing I would say about that recent learning has been a strong interest in support for the idea of strong independent oversight, which again I think it's very important to know that proposals for such an oversight would be welcomed within the sectors. If I may have one last word, I want to add to those very positive comments this morning about the draft regulation. We also believe that it's an extremely good basis on which to proceed. It's a framework which is supportive of ensuring respect for human rights. We can strengthen that, of course, including in terms of oversight, but it's an extremely good basis on which to proceed.
Well, thank you very much. Since you are speaking already and you have just mentioned the fact that maybe this morning the speakers didn't focus enough on the risk-based approach of the regulatory framework. Do you think that some applications are riskier than others? Do you have evidence for that? And maybe a related question is, do you think that there is a trade-off between fundamental rights and innovation?
No, I don't. But let me begin with the risks. Yes, of course. I think it's empirically self-evident that different applications will convey different levels of risk. There are benign applications in toys. And there are extraordinarily important applications in surgery on human beings. So it goes without saying. It's why we welcome the risk pyramid approach. We first saw it in the model proposed by the independent report out of Germany, and now it's been reflected in the draft regulation. We see it makes a lot of sense. And again, it also takes account of the ubiquity of AI and the fact that inevitably regulation will have to make choices about where to engage deeply and where to maintain a light touch. But coming to the second part of your question, the more provocative one, if I may, it's based, we often hear it. And I'd suggest that when we hear it out there, it's often based on a misunderstanding of human rights. Human rights are perceived to be an absolute non-negotiable monolith of you may nots. No, no, no. But of course, that's not how the human rights legal system works in practice. It's sophisticated, it's got checks and balances. One right has to be limited in the interests of another right. Take the application of, take tracing applications for COVID. There you could say that in the interests of the right to health, there had to be some limitation on the right to privacy. But that kind of trade-off is happening every day in every context of human rights. But even once we understand human rights correctly, it still promotes innovation. Take, for example, the level of trust it inspires in users. If a user knows that an application is not going to impinge on fundamental or human rights, the level of trust rises and the climate for innovation is expanded. Business investment rises when there's an awareness that the AI application is compliant with law. And a very important dimension of that compliance is compliance with the applicable human rights and fundamental rights law. So it promotes investment, which promotes innovation. And the final point I'd make is that it's increasingly the case, and it's very welcome, that corporate social responsibility is becoming ever more important in terms of the business world's self-understanding. In some contexts, it's as important now as profit. And it's into that situation that promotion of fundamental rights compliant AI is seen as very welcome indeed, and ultimately, again, promoting of innovation.
Thank you. Andy, at the OECD, you chair meetings with many members, many countries. Do you see a common view on this relationship between respect of fundamental rights and innovation, or do you see differences in thinking among member states?
Well, so I agree. It's the word trade-off is wrong, but as was said this morning, I think by Ms. Brill and Ms. van der Horst, getting the balance and squaring the circles, they said, is going to be a little bit harder, easier said than done, okay? Because there is, innovation involves risk. This is inherent in the whole innovation process. And some people take it, and we have safeguards for it, but it's not something you want to stifle, because as Mr. Viola said this morning too, it's through those innovations that we may find new tools for addressing ethical and human-centric issues that we wouldn't have if we didn't have the innovations. Now, I think a lot is made of differences, even cross-Atlantic differences. And I see these, I listen to them, but I guess we need to begin to flip this conversation. I think the similarities far outweigh the differences between OECD member countries on this. And you can see it. We were talking this morning. There are some states in the United States that have banned facial recognition, as well as New York City, San Francisco, Virginia, and Massachusetts. Now, this is large states. They're working towards a more federal approach through the FTC under the Biden administration. So in my mind, I'm seeing what gap may have existed begin to really narrow. And I think coming around our principles and working at the OECD, this is a good function for us because we do bridge these three continents that are arguably at the forefront of this. I do want to emphasize, because there's an E in OECD too, this is the general purpose technology of our era. This is important and it drives competitiveness. And this is what makes some of the coordination between countries difficult because they're seeking a competitive advantage with each other in terms of trade and so forth. And every AI strategy I've read from a country emphasizes they're pouring money into R&D, they're building these skills, they're trying to make an innovation-friendly environment. So the job for all of us, and I'll stop here, is blending that and ensuring that it doesn't end up with outcomes that we have to try to fix after they've come into the market. And that's why I'm really taken with this notion of getting more upstream in the innovation process, being more engaged in that governance before we get to that outcome.
Indeed. Thank you very much. May I turn now to Mr. Cédric O, as I said earlier, the Secretary of State in France, and France is a member of the OECD. It is also engaged in many international initiatives, like, for example, the Global Partnership on AI, where France will soon be chairing. And of course, France is a member of the European Union and will be holding the presidency in the second half of this year. So how do you see the role of France and GPI in this double role that you're going to have? You're going to have the presidency and you're going to have the presidency of the European Union. And what are the steps that can ensure coordination at the European and the global levels to develop a human-centric approach to AI?
Well, there are a lot of issues that are embedded within the question. I would say first, the philosophy of the GPI and Andrew Wyckoff mentioned that. This is embedded within the OECD, but this is not limited to the OECD with a simple approach, which was ethical AI shall be a discussion and a debate that shall at first be implemented within like-minded countries. And there are a lot of other countries, democratic countries that are not part of the OECD, and we wanted to build that framework where democratic country with attachment to that human-centric approach could unfold. And I do think that we need those kind of places to have those discussions because obviously there is a framework that is Europe, but the debate is and we are addressing that point today, wider than Europe. This is the first issue. As far as Europe is concerned, I would say that France is laying the emphasis on a few points. Obviously, we will be building on top of what the Slovenian presidency is doing as far as making the AI Act progress. I do think that, and building on top of the discussion that just happened, there are a few things that are heavily required and is concerned, especially in the technological area. And to some extent, we had a very good political result with the GDPR, but we must learn from how to put it, the insufficiency of the GDPR. And I would say that the first thing as far as AI Act is concerned in Europe is harmonization. So we need a harmonized approach, which is bottom line in Europe. That is both true from the legal point of view, but also from an enforcement point of view. And we know that to some extent, the enforcement of the GDPR can be improved, to put it mildly. The second issue that I want to lay the emphasis on, and we just had the discussion, and I completely abide by what Michael O'Flaherty was saying, is that the human right approach is not contradictory to a balanced approach. And those debates shall be with precise question and on some balanced question. And I do believe that we should keep in mind in Europe that if we want to be at the table of the discussion, I mean, from a worldwide point of view, we need to have players and stakeholders, I mean, in the business sector that are at the table of the discussion and that are on a par, technology speaking, with what the Americans and the Chinese are doing. So that's why regulation is heavily needed, but that should always go along innovation. Otherwise, you're talking about something that you don't even master. And today, we're not completely part of the discussion as far as business is concerned. The major players are American and Chinese, and we have to keep that in mind. The last point that I want to address, and that is important for France, is flexibility. And I want to get back to the GDPR question. I do believe that, and once again, getting back to Michael O'Flaherty is saying we can have very solid and important principles, but the implementation should be flexible as far as questions that are tackled are concerned. I do believe that as far as technology are concerned, a part of the answer is in protocols. Which kind of protocols do you implement? And what are the technical reassurance that you give that the ethical principles that you want to abide by are respected? So, and we see that to that extent, GDPR also can be improved insofar as it might be not enough opening some room for experimentation. So I do believe that those are the 3 points that we have to build AI regulation in the coming years, as far as Europe is concerned: harmonization, a balanced approach, and flexibility.
Thank you very much. And now I turn to Mrs. Oliveira. So these are the difficulties or the challenges that we have for a regulatory framework in the European Union. It will be difficult, and we heard also from the OECD, some of these discussions can be difficult among countries from different regions of the world. So at UNESCO, which is really promoting a global approach, how do you think we can best respond in such a complicated topic and area to the needs of the different regions and countries to foster the development of AI?
Wow, thank you. This is really the question, So, well, a truly global approach that fosters innovation while providing, safeguards to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, it really needs to convene and listen to all different voices so that we can really effectively balance the utility we derive from AI and its potential for harm to different communities. UNESCO's advantage in this area is that it's a really global organization that has a clear mandate in digital transformation. So that enables us to leverage the many initiatives that are taking place already to identify common positions while also expanding and complementing them. Just give you an example. In the last 5 years, between 2015 and 2020, 117 initiatives have published AI ethics principles around the world, but the geographic scope is very skewed, with only, with 91 of them emerging in Europe and North America for obvious reasons. But while these initiatives help us to identify common elements on which to build global consensus on the principles for AI governance and regulation and etc., we really need to bring in other perspectives, particularly from stakeholders that are less heard in global dialogue. So UNESCO's draft recommendation on the ethics of AI benefited from this widespread engagement. 193 countries have spent over 100 hours negotiating the text, which leads to a truly global document. So, from our side, we taking this local to the global level is really important, but we do the inverse route as well. We take the global to the local. There's a need for norms, for standards, for guidelines, for capacities at regional and national levels too. So that's why we conduct, for example, AI needs assessments, such as the one that we conducted in Africa, and that we'll do in other regions as well. The Africa survey showed us that there are many common concerns around the region. For example, issues of data protection, of skills and training for youth, for education, the needs for strengthening capacities for policymakers, lack of data sets in African languages, and so on. So there's also differences that offer various entry points for engagement. For example, in Cape Verde, they want to use AI for fisheries, and in Botswana, they want to use it for forestry. Capturing sectoral views becomes relevant as well. So the importance of us bringing in these different perspectives and helping to mediate and consolidate them, convening these different viewpoints, is what enables a really global perspective to emerge. So that's how we are, and why we build regional and national capacities to enable more countries to be well informed and participate in global dialogue, which then strengthen a global approach that responds to different needs, across the world.
Thank you. So, Gregor Stroen, different needs around the world. I mean, your organization has also got members, many different countries with probably different views as well. And you also want to promote legislation somehow, or binding instruments at least. How do you achieve in reaching consensus and also at avoiding duplication of effort? Because we now hear many different organizations, including the European Union, and sometimes we do very similar activities. How do we avoid duplication of effort?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I think it's crucial to all the efforts that we're making in reining in the benefits of AI. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, what are the problems that we're solving? And then we have to look at what tools that we have at our disposal. And international organizations, by my opinion, are tools. No offense to organizations, but they don't have subjectivity, so but what I mean by that is they have a certain mandate, they have a certain capacity, competence, a certain scope, both territorially and in terms of what issues they can address. And we need to look at the work of these organizations as complementary in the long run. And of course, these organizations consist of stakeholders with different interests, both due to tradition, culture, and due to temporary political interest. Democratic countries nowadays quickly become authoritarian, and hopefully also vice versa. And I like the explanation by Secretary of State, Mr. O, on the motivation on how the democratic countries forming the bulk of GPAI. In the case of Council of Europe, one of the goals is to promote democracy, even when there is a lack of it, by creating standards for it. So this is perhaps a difficult task at the first stage, but it's a worthwhile task. And what we're trying to do is to see and convince the countries ranging from Atlantic to the Pacific on what are the reasons for implementing some standards, both regarding AI and other technologies or behaviors, that would be beneficial to their citizens in order to scale up individual human rights to the society level. This is basically what democracy means. And how are we dealing with this? At the Council of Europe, first of all, we're trying to, at least at CAHAI that I'm chairing, we're trying to avoid discussing about the issues that are technologically neutral or technological, or that are in the competence of others. For example, we rely, or hopefully we will rely quite a lot on the work of both OECD in terms of the work they did about classifications, terminology. We appreciate also the input of our members and observers, such as Fra, regarding the experiences and insight into the examples of how AI has been influencing or impacting societies. And we're using this to create a framework that would primarily obligate member states, not the industry, not the users, but we're looking at the framework that would translate the general obligation that all our member states already have, which is to protect and promote human rights, rule of law, and democracy in the context of AI. How to address the issues of design, development, research, and application of AI so that we have different stakeholders, different actors, developers, designers, and primarily the public administration, the state. What are their roles? What are their responsibilities? And how these roles and responsibilities can translate into rights for citizens and obligations for the state, and the mechanisms on how to do this. Of course, we will not get a complete consensus at the end. You never do. But you will have as unanimous body of work ready for an adoption in a legally binding instrument, which again, I liked Andy's referral that it is, in the case of OECD, it's E, it's about economy, and basically it's about all of us. We all depend on economy, and human rights are just one of the layers that we need to take into account. We also need to take into account the climate change. We also need to take into account peace among nations, but this is the mandate of the United Nations, for example. So we are doing what we can within the layer that is mandated to us, and my approach to this is to remind our member states that while they are members of Council of Europe, but also European Union, or some United Nations or OECD, they still have an obligation to their citizens to be a full-fledged member of the organization that they adhere to or that they joined, in this case the Council of Europe, and they need to pay attention also to the human rights, rule of law and democracy layer. So maybe a bit high-level answer, but I can go more in detail later on.
No, that's very useful. Actually, on this note, I would like to ask Mr. O, as he's the Secretary of State of a country like France, who's a member of the Council of Europe, of the OECD, of the European Union, of UNESCO, and probably therefore involved in all the different initiatives in AI, in this case, that are being undertaken by these organizations. But how difficult it is, how difficult is it to navigate all the requirements of the different organizations? Is it very complex, or are the organizations very complementary?
Well, I would not say that as far as climate change is concerned, there are too many initiatives. And I do think that to some extent, the political and democratic pressures that we are feeling from our people to better regulate innovation is requiring not one single initiative, but to play at all levels. And to be honest, there is not the same implication within the EU discussion that is today crystallizing into a regulation or a project of regulation, and the discussion that we are having within the GPI or within the UNESCO and so on and so on. And I do think that we should have those parallel tracks. Obviously, to some extent, there are a lot of commonality between those tracks. There are a lot of things that talk to each other. Sometimes there are things that are a little bit in parallel or overlapping, but I do think that this is a global discussion, and to be straightforward, we don't have the same discussion with China within the UNESCO than the one that we are having with the US, than the one that we're having with our European partners. So I do think that all those frameworks are useful, and that we should have that debate at different levels.
Thanks. Would anybody like to react to these words? Yes, Michael, please.
Thank you. I've been listening with great interest, and of course, I spent my whole life working in issues of human rights. But I've found over all those years working in the United Nations, and now in the European Union, that you can never have too many human rights commitments. So if we have a coherent set of human rights demands and oversight systems across the different organizations, that will ultimately lead to better protection of human rights on the ground. The key is that the institutions need to talk to each other. And not just in the design stage, which is what we've been reflecting on here. And I want to say that the collaboration that we have with the Council of Europe is fantastic in this moment of its reflections on AI and our own efforts. But of course, the commitment, the cooperation has to continue into the implementation stage. That's when the institutions tend to go their own way. And so we need to see a future where eventually there'll be, let's say, Council of Europe, United Nations, and EU, all in different ways overseeing artificial intelligence, but they need to do it in a close collaboration and a close maintenance of contact. By the way, the last thing I'd say is when it comes again to human rights, some levels of cooperation are actually required not just out of practicality but out of principle, because we only have one global set of human rights commitments deriving from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's so important that we don't go off in different directions with our interpretations, even contradicting each other. That would be a very, very dangerous road to go down.
Yeah, that's very useful. Andy?
I just wanted to say I don't really envy Mr. O in his job trying to navigate all these different groups, but we're trying to make it easier for him. The OECD AI principles benefited from the European Union, the Council of Europe, and UNESCO all contributing to these principles. I also think there's third parties like the Joseph Stefan Institute. I think we're all taking advantage of that act as glue, bringing us together, and with that we build trust and a knowledge of each other's strengths and weaknesses, and it goes to what Gregor was saying about the complementarity between the different initiatives. This afternoon, I think we'll see a manifestation of that with the Global Policy.ai launch and other international initiatives that show that we are trying to seize on each other's strengths to advance the global dialogue as best we can.
Mariella, you would like to say something?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, I think that, you know, the very important comments that everybody make is about how we must ensure that, there is partnership, there is international cooperation, there's complementarity, and that, this is what leads to engagement that is inclusive and multi-stakeholder. In our role, we very much attempt to bring in the groups that are sometimes left behind by other organizations, such as indigenous communities, youth, persons with disabilities, researchers from different disciplines, regions that are left behind, that we ensure the AI development and use, they can incorporate inputs and count on their ownership, leading to the fact that it's trusted by a wide range of stakeholders. So that what informs the development and application of really robust regulation. Technological advance have social implications, and regulation is very complicated because there's until a technology has been extensively developed and widely used, impacts on society are difficult to predict. So working together, we strengthen approaches by ensuring that we assess risks, that we consider the impacts of AI technologies in an inclusive manner on all peoples, which then reduces risks, foster innovations, advance sustainable development in line with human rights. And that's why we work together, so well. And that's why we're so proud, for example, of working together with OECD, the Council of Europe, World Bank, European Commission, ITU, Inter-American Development Bank, in launching this important global policy AI platform that will really bring consolidate knowledge from the various international organizations and build upon our complementarities. We need to close the gaps and avoid the overlaps, absolutely.
Okay, so if I were to ask you what would be the key element to really achieve effective international cooperation for the promotion of trustworthy AI, what is it for you?
For me, it would be partnership, partnership, partnership. This is exactly, by working together, by sharing different views, by, sharing our knowledge. This is how we build, a digital ecosystem that is responsive, to the needs of all, that really avoids, the risks and mitigates those risks, avoids the harm, incorporates the positive side, and ensures that everybody can benefit, from emerging technologies such as AI.
And Andrew, what would it be for you, the key element for AI?
Well, I think effective trust, whether it's international, in your own household, whatever comes down to developing a trust with one another, knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses, as I just said, but also everybody putting in the hard work. There's a lot to be done here, and it's about identifying pieces of the puzzle that we can assemble, each individually, then collectively put them together to begin to crack the problem. And this is why I think new groups like GPI will bring a really important element that I think had been missing to this equation. But there's a lot more work to be done. Just quickly, AI as we think of it today will not be what AI is in 5 years. Okay, so we need to keep thinking around the corner so we don't get caught short. And I think having that type of foresight and looking forward capability is something we all need to be able to work on together.
Yeah, in fact, Gregor, what do you think the key instrument is, and how can we always be ready to embrace AI given technological change and all the changes that we will witness, as Andy said, in the next few years?
Well, I've said this a number of times that it's not AI that I fear, it's still the humans. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's one instrument that's going to address these issues, and I'm not afraid of the general purpose AI or matrix style or Terminator style AI that's going to be our doom. What I'm concerned with are the problems that we have right now, which are also inhibitors of innovation. And this is, if I go from high level to granular level, and just one of the biggest grains that I see is transparency of the use of AI by national authorities. And I don't mean the transparency of an algorithm, but the fact that AI is being used for certain purposes, especially when they impact individual rights. In that case, we are seeing right now, especially in the COVID situation, that even the obligations that the states have with GDPR are sometimes skipped over. And I'm fear that this might continue also with AI or other applications of new technologies. And what I would like, first of all, is sincere commitment by the states that their citizens are at the forefront of their interest. And when they're applying artificial intelligence, as we're talking about now, that they are transparent, that they are what kind of systems they're using, and of course give a possibility of redress to individuals so that they can protect their own rights when necessary.
And Michael, when you look at these international organizations detailing what they do and their viewpoints, do you see a lot of complementarities? Do you see differences? Is there any advice you would like to give for the protection of fundamental rights with AI?
Well, maybe just one thing, and that's don't be intimidated. The AI is eminently subject to regulation. There are so many myths out there, and a new one is appearing every week. Myth that it's too expensive. Myth that it's too complicated. Myth that you'll strangle innovation, as we discussed earlier on. Every single one of these can be tackled. Ultimately, AI is a technology designed by humans, used by humans for outcomes that impact humans. And if human rights can't engage with that, then human rights itself is deeply ineffectual. So keep going, would be my last word.
Thank you. And I would like to ask maybe Mr. O to conclude and maybe react to what you have heard and what you think on the efficiency of promoting AI through the international organization.
Well, if I may, I would like to a little bit unframe the debate as far as what has been saying. I completely, I think a lot has been said as far as the partnerships that we have to build, the cooperation between both the multilateral approach, but also the cooperation between international institutions and so on and so on. I would like to lay the emphasis on one point, which is enforcement. Because this is one thing to set up principles and to set up rules, and this is another one to be able to enforce them as far as something that is deep technology is concerned. And I think that one of the challenges that as public powers, as state, as institution or international organization we are facing is the asymmetry, to put it like that, between the technological power of some players, which are defining and designing things that could be a black box for public powers or independent authorities, and the ability of those authorities. Today, I do think that we are making progress as far as defining the framework, the legal framework, the ethical framework is concerned. But the issue of what is the true ability of public power to enforce the law, first to check what's happening really on the field or on the networks, and second, to enforce the law and to be able to be on a par in terms of technical discussion with the private players is still something that is a land to conquer.
Thank you very much. And on this note, I would like to conclude this panel. I would just simply like to remind again that we are discussing the proposed regulatory framework by the European Union in Council, and very soon with the European Parliament as well, and that we will also be, looking also at international organizations a little bit to help us also to discuss our approach with international partners. And I also, of course, want to thank also the participation of the Agency for Fundamental Rights, and thank them also for all the evidence they have provided us in our work on the regulatory framework. But really, I look forward to continue collaborating with you, and actually there is going to be a discussion on the Global Policy Initiative at 4 o'clock today. And now I thank all the panelists. Thank you very much for participating to this event, also on behalf of the Commission and of the Slovenian Presidency. Really a very warm thanks. And I leave you with a video from the United States now.
Yes, thank you very much to all of you. So we are staying in